Hi, welcome to my channel. My name is Alexis and I'm an amateur genealogist, and this is Branches. In this channel I discuss everything genealogy, stories handed down through my family, stories of other people, and DNA, and just everything genealogical. In today's video I will be reading off a transcript of Griffin Webb. He was a World War I veteran. He is also my great-grandfather, and he grew up here in Mississippi, and he was like I said, a World War I veteran, and this is just kind of a transcript of his time during the war and then also afterwards. Griffin Webb was born April 24th, 1896 in Jackson County, Mississippi, which is on the coast. He passed away January 20th, 1987 in Mobile, Alabama. In 1979, in the summer, his stepson, Glenn Buckingham, had a conversation with him and recorded said conversation. And what I'm about to read is a transcript of that conversation. The conversation went as follows. Glenn says, "Tell us a little bit about the difference in World War I compared with World War II, Korean, and Vietnam." And Griffin says, "The difference I've seen in the wars was World War II, Korean War, and Vietnam didn't use bayonets to fight with. Never heard anyone say they had used them. You were in, you didn't use them. World War I used more bayonets than they did bullets." Now keep in mind, at the time of this conversation, Griffin was 83 years old. So his memory may not be as great as it was when he was younger, but he still reveals a lot of information about his time in the war, which is really interesting and sad, but I'll go on. Glenn says more hand-to-hand combat, and Griffin says, "Yes, hand-to-hand combat, that's right. When we broke that Hindenburg line, they went over the top at daybreak. Just was breaking day and wasn't good daylight. And they were 3 miles deep in before they stopped. That took all the front lines the Germans had. They got them clean out of the trenches altogether. And there's where we lost so many men. Lost a terrible amount of men, but we captured a bunch. Captured, I believe there were 45,000. 45,000 men captured. When we got to Theacourt, we stopped. That was a millionaire's town. Had been, but we shot it flat down. Wasn't nothing left of it. Pieces of buildings left there. Of course, I didn't go right in the town. I went off to the hills, top of the high hills where you went down into the valley. That town was in the valley, and the Germans had us a headquarters. It had been there right at 4 years. They had their headquarters there, and they had a railroad run into there. And we captured the train and all as it was pulling out. The gun I was working on shot the railroad into the trestle and stopped the train. Had 2 16-inch naval rifles and 4 12s and 2 or 3 carloads of rifles and ammunition. Stop them, gentlemen. Cut that track into right in front of them." Now, my great-grandpa, Griffin Webb, he was in charge of the mules pulling the cannons, basically, the big guns. And because of that, he basically was deaf. He basically ended up becoming deaf because of that, among other problems. Okay, so Glenn goes on. He says, "You were one of the first Americans that was caught in mustard gas. When was that?" Griffin says, "Well, we went through mustard gas after they shot it back on us. They shot that mustard gas back on us. Of course, that's using artillery. They shot that mustard gas back, and we were on top of the hill. And after we moved and went on across Death Valley and got up on top of the hill, then first you could see towards Germany. There wasn't nothing planted for 4 years in there, and grass was just growing. They used mustard gas on us there. I believe we went through it started one evening and stopped the next morning. It took about 3 hours for the gas to vanish away. Now what happens now? Glenn asked. Because of the mustard gas you received back there in World War I in your days of farming, what happened? And Griffin answers saying, well, that mustard gas is bad on you. It will break out on you. It settles to water. That gas will go to water. And of course, it rained there all the time. Rain and getting in shell holes and things and getting it run over the tops of your shoes and get it in your shoes. It would just peel the skin off your feet. Just peel the top skin like a snake shedding. It's got to be painful. I can't even imagine. And Glenn says, now when you were a younger man and plowing, wasn't it true when you were plowing your hands would just break open and bleed, and your feet too? And Griffin says, yeah, that's right. And Glenn says, you'd have to dip them in hot Vaseline to keep them from cracking open. And Griffin says, yeah, that's right. Now since I got up as old as I am now, my feet's bad, but not too bad about breaking out. But my hands have quit breaking out. And Glenn comes back and says, getting back to hand-to-hand combat that you say was more prevalent in World War I, what would you say is the difference in their bayonet and the American bayonet? They had the same kind of bayonet, but they didn't know how to use it like our men did. Our men would swing the bayonet and their men would run with it under their arm and try to gouge you. Our boys would just grab the bayonet when they'd bring it around and savor him. I know over there at Reedonville, there was a little village. Population of it was about 25. We shot it down. Didn't figure there was anybody in it at all. The infantry went on into it, and when they got into it, the battery of artillery, I was in fallows, right along behind the infantry, as close to the first line as they could to shoot the sniper guns, machine gun nestles, and all that. When we got to that town, figured there wasn't nobody, and we must have captured 100 men, besides the ones that got killed, and they were just laying dead all over the place. They would bring them out on the road, our men and the Germans both, and lay them along the edges of the road. Some of them were wounded so bad they would just die. They were laying dead all along the road, head and foot there. That lasted about a mile. They were just solid, both sides of the road, and we drove right down between them. And Glenn asked, how old were you when you went in? Griffin says he was over 21. He had to be about 22. And Glenn says, you had some brothers in the service too. Griffin says 2. One went to the front. He passed 100 yards in front of me and I didn't see him. He went in and come out with red placements. He was a tributary. My younger brother had the flu and he stayed back in France. He never got up to the front. He never seen any action, didn't get into any fighting. Glenn asked him, what were some of the major battles you got in? Griffin, of course, responds as well, the Saint Mihiel front, that was the biggest battle fought in France to win the war. France had never fought a battle that big. That battle went 6 miles deep and was 20 miles long. There was only 3 American divisions, 5th Division and the 2nd Division, the Marines, and the 1st Division was our men. That's what it took. There wasn't too many men left. And then Glenn says, was you in Bayeux Wood and Chateau Thierry? I'm sorry, I'm butchering these names. I don't speak French, so. And Griffin says, yeah, and we were on the Chateau Thierry front. We didn't lose many men up there. The infantry lost a lot of men up there, but not the artillery. They was all on the one side of the mountain. We were on the other side of it. We was at the foot of it, and they were up near the top of it. That was a long way up there, too. France's 75 wouldn't go up there good. Glenn says, what did Americans call the French? And Griffin says, French soldiers? They just called them French soldiers. Glenn asked, did you ever hear them referred to as frogs because of the way they jumped them trenches? Griffin said, well, I heard that. The English had that name too, English frogs. Glenn says, it's hard to say how you feel about something. How did you feel when you knew you were going to have to go over the top of the trenches in World War I more than they do now? They call them today foxholes or something like that, but yours were long trenches that reached for miles. How did you feel when they blew the whistle to go over the top, to charge 50 yards to another trench, where you knew you had to go into hand-to-hand combat on top of another man? What were you feeling? Griffin responds, that combat you're talking about, making a drive, I never was in a short drive. We always had a long drive because I was in a sharp division. As soon as we got there, we went into a battle close to the Argonne, and the 1st Division was a sharp division. They just go in and make a drive here. The French, American, or the English would come in, take the front, then move back out and go someplace else to go and make another drive. That's what we did in the Chateau Bay. We left there. We were the sharp division. We came down to the Argonne and we stopped a pretty good sized town and made a drive there. Drove them back about a mile. Then the French took over there, but before we got to the mountains, there were mountains there. We made another drive from the Chateau Bay. And the English took over there, and the 1st Division was taking a rest. They had been there before us. They had drove them away from Paris, France. The 1st and 2nd Division had drove them away from there. And Glenn asks, how long were you in France? Griffin says he was in France for over a year. Glenn asks, how did you get back home? And Griffin answers and says, we came back by boat from Brest, France to New York, and then we came to Camp Shelby. My time wasn't up, but they discharged me. I had enlisted for 3 years, but I didn't quite make it. I still had two or 3 months, but they discharged me just the same. And then Glenn asked what he did after he came back. And Griffin says, I came home. I came back to my people in Fontainebleau, Mississippi, to my 2 sisters and my dad and 2 of my brothers. I was discharged August 5th, 1919. And Glenn said, what did you do after you came home? And he said, then there wasn't such a thing as compensation. Unless you had both hands off or both legs off or blind, then the government would pay you a small salary. Glenn said, but at the time you got out, there wasn't any 5 to 20 or rest and relaxation. Griffin said, that's right, straight back to work. Of course, one thing and then another. You'd get any work you could. Times were hard. Times were just like they were in Hoover's time. There wasn't any work. When I came back home, you couldn't get a job. There wasn't any work. So Glenn asked what he started doing. He said he fooled around there at the house with his folks and farmed a little bit and worked out in the timber work. And Glenn said, when did you get to be the fisherman you're noted for? Everybody in the Gulf Coast says if there is a fish out there, Griffin Webb, he'll see it. Griffin says, yeah, that's true. Glenn says, how did you get that great skill of spotting fish like you do and know where they are? Griffin says, well, if the fish comes to the top of the water and if the winds are blowing, there will be a certain ripple, and you'll know that it's a fish making that ripple. But you don't know what kind they are till you catch them, but you know they are fish. Glenn said, I've seen people and heard of people that would go down on that by and walk for miles and walk right past them, and you come by and say, throw your net in about 15 foot, and they can't pull it up. There's so many fish. Griffin says, yep, that's right. Glenn says, you can just see those ripples? Griffin said, yeah, that's right. That's what you go by. You go by those ripples they make in the water. It will show up. Trout will come up and get into shrimp, and they'll just be churning it up, but they won't be coming to the top of the water, not clean out of the water. But they come so close to the top, they make a ripple, and you can tell that's a mullet, flounder, speckled trout, redfish, or Spanish mackerel. Glenn asked, how long did you live in Fontainebleau? Griffin said, I lived in Fontainebleau near all my life, you might say. I lived there counting the time I was in service and all. Taking that out, I lived over 25 years. Glenn asked, what did you do after that? And Griffin said, mostly farm work. Glenn said, you left Fontainebleau, and where did you go from there? Griffin said, I went up on Van Cleve Road. And Glenn says, there you were married. You married before you went to Van Cleve. You were married to Lucy, and then you moved to Van Cleve. Griffin says, then I moved to Harrison County, and I've been in Harrison County near about all the time, except I've been in Stone County, near about 25 years? I was on that farm 20 years, wasn't I? Glenn said, I think you were. That's what I'd say. How many children did you have? 9, Griffin says. 9 children. Let me count them up. 6 girls and 3 boys. Glenn said, hey, you better count again. Griffin said, I didn't count you. And Glenn says, counting me then, 4 boys and 6 girls. So there's 10 kids. Griffin said, yeah. Glenn said, I don't know how you'd look at it because you have lived such a wonderful life and still are just able to go and do things. But I think the time I remember the most, or probably the closest to you, is at Van Cleve. Griffin said, yeah. Glenn said, I stayed up there with you on the farm. Griffin said, well, that was back in Hoover's time. That's when there wasn't nothing to do at all and stuff was dirt cheap. Groceries were. You could get a 24-pound sack of flour for 90 cents. Can you imagine how cheap? Oh man, not gonna happen today, that's for sure. So Griffin says, we raised it right there on the farm. And Glenn says, what did we do for meat that we didn't have? Remember, if you got tired of beef, which you had cows, what did we do? Griffin said, yeah, but before we had pork and we had our own bacon. Glenn responds, yeah, but before we got our own hogs, what did we do? Griffin says, well, we used to fish for meat and we'd hunt and eat squirrels and different stuff. Glenn says, what about those doggone wild hogs we used to get? And Griffin says, and wild hogs and stuff like that. We had us a smokehouse. We'd kill them wild hogs and cure them, make bacon out of them. There ain't a hog in that place now. They came out of the marsh down there. No sign of hogs down there now. Glenn says, what was the name of that old brindle dog you used to have? That dog got ripped up by those hogs and you sewed him right up there in the swamp. Buster, wasn't it? Griffin, yeah, Buster. And had one that's name was Black. Glenn asked, you used to hunt hogs with them. Griffin said, yeah, and those hogs would cut them up and we had a sewing needle I'd carry with me, take a knife and poke a hole in his hide and run the thread through there and tie it up on him. Glenn said, and that old dog lived, didn't he? Griffin said, oh yeah, he was well in not too many days. He'd go right back and maybe get a cut again. Glenn said, while you was there at Van Cleve, you used to have to get me every once in a while with that bullwhip. You had a watermelon. Griffin says, yeah, that patch of watermelons that you and Herbert went in there and plugged all of them. Glenn said, you came out there with that bullwhip and spotted us all the way to the house. Griffin said, yeah. And Glenn said, just enough to sting, not enough to cut, but you were really good with that bullwhip. Griffin said, yeah, runt that watermelon. That melon was the moon and star melon. Glenn said, you'd perfected that all along the coast. You was the only one to have that. That was quite something. Griffin said, yeah, the only one. It had moons and stars on it. Lost the seeds of them things. Yeah. Oh, that's a shame. He lost the seeds. Special watermelons. Glenn says the other melons here on the coast is the rattlesnake type. Yours had a clear green skin with a moon and star. And Herb and I went out there and plugged them. And Griffin said some of them with white stars and the moon would be kind of red. Glenn said, how big was that farm? Griffin said, only 15 acres. Glenn responded, seemed bigger than that when you got out there pulling corn. Griffin said, yeah, and you couldn't sell it because nobody had any money to buy it. Alright guys, that's it on the part 1 of the Griffin Webb transcript that took place in the summer of 1979 with his stepson Glenn Buckingham. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button so that you can be notified when part 2 comes live. And don't forget to like this video and give it a thumbs up. Leave a comment down below if you're interested And I will see you guys next time. Stay curious.